Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and today's topic is Tecumseh and the War of 1812. So as just a quick reminder, we're doing a 5-day unit on the War of 1812. We've already done day 1, which was an overview of the war. Today we're focusing on Tecumseh and the role of the Native Americans in the war. Tomorrow we're going to talk about some key events, including the burning of the White House and the creation of the Star-Spangled Banner. Then we'll talk about the rise of Andrew Jackson, and we'll finish off with some impacts from the War of 1812. We're going to start by talking about Tecumseh. So Tecumseh is a Shawnee Indian born in what is now Ohio in 1768. And as a young man, he grew up hunting and traveling the plains of Ohio, fishing on the Ohio River. And he was a generally well-loved child, but his father dies when he's 6 years old, fighting frontiersmen who are trying to settle in Shawnee land. So his father dies when Tecumseh's sick, when his father is wounded in battle. And his father actually has some dying words that he tells both Tecumseh and his older brother, and he makes his children promise as he dies to always bring honor and virtue to their family. Well, sadly, Tecumseh's mother was pregnant at the time, and she ends up giving birth the next year in 1775. When Tecumseh's 7, she gives birth to triplets. And one of those triplets will feature very heavily later in the story. One of the triplets doesn't survive childhood, doesn't survive the birth, so there's twins that survive, and one of them will become pretty much equal to Tecumseh later on in this story. But you can imagine the sadness and anger that Tecumseh had towards whites for killing his father. So this is the area we're talking about. Right here in Ohio. This is the Great Lakes region, and the Shawnee are one of many tribes. Often seen as the most powerful tribe is the Iroquois near Lake Erie, but the Shawnee are one of many tribes in this region. And just as a point of context, in 1776, so that's about when Tecumseh's 8 years old, the United States has a revolution against Britain for our independence. And the Shawnee, Tecumseh's tribe, actually fight on the side of the British. So many Native American tribes were forced to choose sides or chose to choose sides, and Tecumseh's people actually fought with the British against the Americans. As Tecumseh grows, he becomes a very skilled, renowned hunter within his tribe. There's a legend that he once killed 16 buffalo with one quiver of arrows. But he becomes a great outdoorsman. He's seen as a very, very good warrior and very smart. And eventually, because once the revolution's over, well, some frontiersmen who had fought, some United States frontiersmen who had fought against the British, were pretty angry at the tribes that supported the British in the revolution. So frontiersmen actually traveled to the Shawnee village and destroyed it when Tecumseh was about 10 years old. And so as he gets older, Tecumseh starts retaliating along the Ohio River and destroying U.S. boats. He begins to become like a leader of a group of warriors attacking any sort of U.S. trade on the Ohio River. And eventually, he gets more and more powerful within the tribe. He has more and more confrontations. And he becomes more and more angry, specifically against the United States, who continue to attack and destroy his tribe. So I just want to give you a little context here. So Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd president of the United States when we purchased the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. In 1804, Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark to explore new territory. And then it's really the events leading into the War of 1812 that don't have anything to do with the Native Americans, like the Embargo Act, which was a U.S. act that hurt Americans, that said we would no longer trade allow British or French ships into our ports. There's also impressment happening, and that's where British sailors keep taking U.S. sailors off boats and making them join the British Navy. And the United States is trying to stay neutral in the war between France and England, but this all spills over into a larger picture of the War of 1812. And you have to remember that for the Native Americans, and Tecumseh specifically, tensions are running high. Just like Tecumseh is attacking boats with his other young men on the Ohio River, American settlers are moving farther and farther into Shawnee and other Native American land. So both sides are fighting, both sides are violent. By 1790, thousands of white settlers had moved into the Northwest Territory of the United States, and the Northwest Territory is defined as what we now think of as Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois. Many of the treaties that the tribes would sign with the United States government aren't honored. Many settlers are building homes on Indian land, hunting food that Native Americans rely on. So there's an uprising that has a tremendous effect on Tecumseh in 1791 when a Miami native chief named Little Turtle, who's actually a great warrior, unites the Miami Nation and other surrounding tribes to attack white settlements in the Indiana area. And for a while, he's successful, and Tecumseh fights in this war. Now, he's not the chief of this war. He's fighting for a Miami chief named Little Turtle. But he's now getting organized as a military-type strategist, Tecumseh is. And there's a battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Again, this is 1794, so this is before the War of 1812. And at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which the Native Americans chose that name because they had chosen a battle spot to attack the American soldiers where a bunch of trees had fallen. So thinking that would make it hard for the Americans to fight. However, the Americans win that battle, and in response, they make the tribes sign the Treaty of Greenville. And the Treaty of Greenville is where the Miamis and dozens of other tribes sign this treaty, basically trading all of their land of Ohio specifically to the United States. And Ohio will become a state soon after. Now remember, Tecumseh's from Ohio. He just fought to defend Ohio. Tecumseh refuses to sign any treaties, and he is disgusted by the other tribes for selling their land to white people for basically goods that valued about $20,000 today. Blankets, utensils, animals. And more settlers continue to pour in. So Ohio becomes a state in 1803, and the other states become after the war. Illinois becomes a state in 1818, Indiana 1816, etc. But more settlers pour into the area because now Ohio by 1803 is officially a state. So Tecumseh ends up aligning with the British. So the British have their own issues with the United States, and then Tecumseh and the Native Americans share similar issues with against the United States. They share similar issues with the British against the United States. So I just want to point out where we're talking about. Much of the war is fought here in this Indiana territory. Tecumseh and his people have been moved out of Ohio into this Indiana territory. And the United States wants to continue west. Now, a big thing for Britain is, remember, the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase, so they own all these states as well as this whole yellow area. And Britain wants to protect their interest in the Oregon Country. They don't want the United States to continue to expand west. And Britain feels like if they give the Indians, the Native Americans, their own land right here in the Indiana Territory, that will create a buffer where the United States won't expand west anymore and the British can keep the Oregon Country. So one of the big reasons for this whole war is that Britain wanted Washington and Oregon to be part of what would later become Canada, but they wanted to keep this whole area. Now all of this New Spain, California, etc., that's all part of Mexico at this time. So as a grown man, Tecumseh and his brother start to become very important Shawnee leaders and very outspoken critics of other Native Americans settling their lands to whites. And we're going to talk a little bit about Tecumseh's brother. This is one of the triplets that his mother gave birth to in 1775. And they call him the Prophet. Now, the Prophet, whose name is Tenskwatawa, tells other tribes and other Native Americans that he has journeyed to the spirit world. And there he has learned the path that the natives must take if they want to be happy. And he starts to preach that Native Americans should not be corrupted by United States ways of life, white man's ways of life. And they need to start rejecting traded goods such as muskets, cloth, cooking pots, and whiskey. So he's telling other tribes that they need to go back to the old ways and resist the white invaders. And this turns into a whole religious, spiritual movement for the tribes in the Indiana Territory. So the Prophet, Tecumseh's brother, ends up building a town, a village called Prophetstown. And it's right alongside Tippecanoe Creek in what is now Indiana. And it becomes a village for all tribes in the region. And Tecumseh is a great speaker, and he's a great warrior, and he's a great leader. And the prophet brings the spiritual aspect of things. And Tecumseh travels around giving speeches, and he starts to unite the tribes into one tribe starting about 1808. So for about 4 years before the war, he is uniting all the local tribes into one great big tribe with the goal of creating a Native American nation around the Great Lakes region. And Tecumseh's pretty successful. He also, as he gets more and more tribes together, he's able to secure more and more partnership with the British, who see this growing Native American army as a real asset to their war against the United States. So again, Tecumseh's goal, and the British will give it to him, is to have this whole Indiana Territory as Native American country. So in the middle of our country now, we would have a Native American territory, or a Native American country. And Tecumseh is a great speaker. He says in this quote, "The whites have driven us from the great salt water, forced us over the mountains. The way to check and stop this evil is for all red men to unite in claiming a common equal right in the land." Well, I want to introduce the territorial governor of Indiana, a man by the name of William Henry Harrison. And if Tecumseh has a foe, it's William Henry Harrison. So he's in charge of that Indiana region. He's going to go on to become president, the 9th president of the United States. And him and Tecumseh, although he grudgingly respects Tecumseh, he says things like, he, referring to Tecumseh, is one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn established order of things. Tecumseh and Harrison hate each other. Twice Tecumseh goes to Harrison and asks him to leave the land, asks if the Native Americans can have this territory. Twice he tries peacefully, and one time it almost comes to blows. Harrison draws his sword, and Tecumseh grudgingly leaves the scene, but they almost fight at Harrison's office in the Indiana Territory. Well, eventually Harrison's had enough, and by 1811, he decides that this prophet town is getting too big, too powerful, and he gets an army together. Harrison does, of about 1,000 soldiers, and they storm on the prophet town, and he's told Tecumseh he's there to talk peace. And fun fact about Harrison, he does become the 9th president in 1840, But he only serves 32 days in office before dying of pneumonia. And I'll tell you at the meet, but there is a legend that the prophet, Tecumseh's brother, actually cursed Harrison, and that's why he dies in office. So Harrison marches at Tippecanoe. Well, Tecumseh knows it's a trap. He knows it's not a peaceful meeting. So, and that he believes Harrison's actually there to destroy Prophettown. So Tecumseh organizes his soldiers, and the Native Americans attack first. Harrison's caught off guard. However, his men stand their ground for about 2 hours. And really, I think the Native Americans would have won, but they are low on ammunition. So eventually the Native Americans they fight valiantly. Tecumseh fights well, but they run out of ammunition, and the Native Americans have to flee. Prophettown, which has existed for about 3 years at this point, is destroyed, burned to the ground. And now it's a state park in Indiana. And again, this is a huge setback for Tecumseh and his Confederacy. They rebuild Prophetstown, but it's never quite the same. But this just heightens the tensions going into the War of 1812. So now Tecumseh, having had his town destroyed, having his village destroyed, is very willing to partner with the British. He conscripts more and more tribes to his cause, and it is the Native Americans and Britain versus the United States for the War of 1812. The war kicks off, and I'm going to gloss over many of the early battles, but I want to tell you about one British soldier who's the commander of the British Army, a guy by the name of Sir Isaac Brock. And he is seen as like a super soldier in history. He's cunning, he's smart, he's brave, and he's the British commander fighting against the United States alongside Tecumseh. And him and Tecumseh have a great relationship and a lot of trust. Well, unfortunately for the British, early on, Brock is killed. And Brock dies in a battle, seen as a heroic death. But Tecumseh loses his main ally in the British Army. And a couple fun facts about Brock is he is seen as a Canadian hero. He's seen this war, the War of 1812, is actually seen by many Canadian historians as the United States invading Canada. The War of 1812 is viewed by the Canadians as like a great piece of pride in their history, where they defended their land. For them, it's like kind of how we view like the 4th of July and U.S. independence. And Brock is seen as one of the heroes of Canada, even though he's British, but for protecting the British land. So Brock dies, and he's replaced by a man named Henry Proctor. And Tecumseh, who got along great with Brock, does not get along well with this man, Brock's replacement, Henry Proctor. Tecumseh sees him as fat, he sees him as cowardly, he sees him as lazy, and Proctor is not viewed well in history. He is seen as a pretty poor general. And part of the reason why is he does not lead very many successful campaigns against the United States. So Tecumseh and the new British general do not see eye to eye. And this comes to a head in Tecumseh's final battle. Tecumseh will die in the war. He dies pretty early in the war, in 1813, and it's at the Battle of the Thames. And this is a great quote from Tecumseh that I'm going to hopefully put in the context in just a sec, but it says, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it be his will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." That's Tecumseh saying, we will die to protect our land. And what happens at the Battle of the Thames in October of 1813, Proctor, the British general, actually decides that he wants to retreat before the battle. And he abandons the Native Americans who refuse to leave their land. Proctor wants to go up to what is now Canada, hold the forts, and he wants to abandon the Indiana Territory, believing it's too hard to hold. Tecumseh, not wanting to leave his land, rallies his men in a great speech. This is the end of that speech, this quote I just read to you. And he rallies his men in a very famous speech, and the Native Americans stay to fight while the British leave. and Tecumseh is killed in the Battle of the Thames. And with the death of Tecumseh comes the end of that Native American dream to have their own country within what is now the United States. And this is really the last effort, coordinated effort by the Native Americans to put together a big resistance to all this white European expansion across what will become the United States and Canada. And this is really, with Tecumseh's death, it's the end of that dream. It's the end of a lot of things for Native Americans. And it also paves the way for what will be eventually the U.S. expansion into the Oregon Territory. So I wanted to leave you with this. I'm going to play you a clip from a documentary with a reenactment. And this last clip that I'll leave you with is Tecumseh giving his speech. And he's lecturing Proctor and the British who are retreating the scene right before the Battle of the Thames. He's lecturing the British for running away. He's telling them, fine, if you guys leave, if you don't want to fight, we'll fight the Americans ourselves, but at least leave us your weapons and guns. And he's rallying his own people to stand their ground. So I'm going to leave you with a recreation or a reenactment of that speech, and we'll call it a day.
Listen, Father! We are much astonished to see you tying up and preparing to run the other way. You always told us to remain here and take care of our lands, and it made our hearts glad to hear that was your wish. But now, we see you drawing back like a fat animal, running off with its tail between its legs. Listen, Father! The Americans have not yet defeated us by land. We therefore wish to remain and face our enemies. Should they make their appearance, if you have an idea of going away, leave us the guns and ammunition, and you may go and welcome for us. Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we shall leave our bones upon them.
Sadly for the Native Americans, Tecumseh does do just that. He dies on the battlefield fighting bravely. And that really does end the coalition of tribes, most of which just go home without their leader. And if you're wondering what happens to his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, he survives the war, and he just loses a lot of, after Tecumseh's death, he loses his credibility and his power within the tribe, and he actually dies of old age in a cabin in Canada, pretty obscure by the time of his death. All right, 7th graders, again, we'll talk more about the impacts of this and how this affects Washington and the Pacific Northwest in the following days. But for now, thanks as always for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's Ed Puzzle.